In 1622, the settlement of Petersburg, Virginia was established, with the city being incorporated in 1748. Because of its location, it quickly became a major trade center. We had the only bridge that spanned the Appomattox River for 30 miles, along with a harbor that was deep enough for large ships. At the time of the Revolutionary War, Petersburg was actually the second largest shipping center in the Virginia colony. All this business activity was taking place in the area that we know as the Old Town Historic District. This area, the Courthouse Historical District, was residential. In 1815, there was a terrible fire. 3/4 of the city was destroyed. This row of buildings behind me was originally warehouses, and they were built right after that fire. From the time of the Revolutionary War until approximately 1850, this would have been the location of Petersburg's first courthouse. It was located in a mansion, in a house. It was called Spring Hill Mansion. It was also commonly referred to as Prison Hill. It was destroyed in 1860. The pillars from the front of the house, or the gatepost, are now located on Marshall Street in the Poplar Lawn Historic District. In 1830, the railroad came to Petersburg. And with that was a population boom. So it was soon determined that it was time for this city to have a financial area established. And some extremely impressive buildings were constructed. Built in 1833, Tabb Street Presbyterian Church is one of the oldest churches in Petersburg and the oldest church in this district. Between 1838 and 1840, the courthouse was built. This is what remains of the Petersburg Armory. It was built in 1843. St. Paul's Episcopal Church was built in 1856. To accommodate all the business that was coming in from both the harbor and the railroad, a customs house was constructed between the years of 1856 and 1859. Built in 1860, the Petersburg Savings and Insurance Company was one of our first large financial institutions. By 1850, Sycamore Street, along with the neighboring streets of Franklin, Union, and Taft, had become the center for all financial activities. And Petersburg had everything that a modern city could offer. The streets were paved. We had wooden sidewalks. There were plenty of hitching posts for your horse-drawn wagon, in addition to livery stables. In 1847, the telegraph was installed. In 1851, we got gas lighting, and in 1855, a new waterworks plant was opened up. So you could come to Petersburg, you could send correspondence without having to wait for the delays of the Pony Express. You could see at night, and you didn't have to drink from a horse trough or a well. There was fresh running water. Doing business and shopping in Petersburg would have truly been a pleasure. In 1860, the Civil War broke out, and life in the Courthouse Historic District was truly a nightmare. Okay, we had stuff, and the Union forces definitely wanted it. Petersburg was considered a strategic defense point. What we had was 2 blocks that away is the river. That is where the railroad station is, the harbor, and the bridge. Right dead in front of me was the armory. Okay, catty corner to where I'm standing was the telegraph office, And about 2 blocks behind me was the gasworks. So fighting here in the Courthouse Historic District was definitely concentrated. In 1864, the entire city was surrounded by Union forces. That led to the longest siege in the history of the war. It lasted 10 months. The Courthouse Historic District was being shelled very heavily every morning and afternoon by the Union forces. The courthouse tower was being used as a site. The steeples of the churches were being used as targets. Under the porch of Tabb Street Presbyterian Church, a tunnel was dug along with a shelter that was large enough to hold almost 100 people. Everyone who lived here had bomb shelters dug in their yards for both their own protection and to store their valuables. Governmental operations had been moved to the outskirts of town. The interior of the courthouse was being used as a shelter along with a hospital. The roof of the custom house was being used as a signaling station. St. Paul's, along with many other buildings in the Courthouse Historic District, were damaged by shelling. The warehouses were converted into hospitals, and the people who worked in the warehouses were serving duty as both nurses and orderlies. In spring of 1865, the city fell to Union troops. The siege was over. Shortly after that, the war ended and Reconstruction began. After the Civil War, these buildings were repaired and rebuilt by Augustus Wright to house his leather goods warehouse and manufacturing company. He became one of the richest men in Petersburg. In approximately 1870, this building was rebuilt, and it first was the Masons Hall. Later, it became home to the Petersburg Benevolent Mechanics Association. The Oddfellows was one of our largest social groups. They built this building to use as their clubhouse sometime between 1870 and 1885. This was the Zimmer Tobacco Warehouse. It was built in approximately 1890. And this was the YMCA. The first large bank was the National Bank. This building was built in 1886, remodeled in 1906. By the turn of the century, Petersburg had it going on again. We had 5 banks within a 1-block radius, giving us a true financial area. Built in 1900, this was the Seaboard Railway Station. It was only in operation for a few years. Since then, the building has served a multitude of purposes. During World War I, the troops that were stationed at nearby Camp Lee used Sycamore Street as their favorite destination for their entertainment and shopping purposes. It was the perfect place to spend their R&R time. The Palace Theater was built in 1905. It was a favorite of the World War I crowd. Okay, built in 1915, this was the Petersburg Hotel. It was fireproof. It still has a lightning rod on the side. Sycamore Street in Petersburg was actually a premier shopping district. The Globe department store was opened in 1922. And furniture store was opened in 1915. In the 1920s, this White House was both the home and the office of Dr. Wilcox, one of the most well-respected physicians in the area. Built in 1920 on the site of the Charles Watson Estate, this was Watson Court Apartments. In the 1920s, the Progress Index newspaper building was constructed. by the late 1930s, shopping was such a big thing here in Petersburg that we needed to start tearing down buildings to make space for parking lots. This right here used to be the YWCA. In 1935, we got a new post office. Built in the 1930s, this is one of the few buildings that display the Art Deco architectural style. It was built by the Knights of Pythias. It later became the Medical Arts Building. With World War II, our courthouse area started to see a financial upswing again. A few of the manufacturing companies had contracts with the United States military, which left this area flourishing again. After the war, many of these warehouses started to close. Washington Street had been lined with tobacco warehouses, and after the Second World War, they were closed. In the 1950s, they were demolished, and these one-story retail locations were built in their place. This is the Reverend Robert G. Williams. He also went by the initials RG. He was pastor of the Zion Baptist Church, which is located in the Halifax Triangle Historic District. He was a civil rights leader here in Petersburg. He organized the sit-ins, he organized the marches, and he was a founding member of the PIA, or Petersburg Improvement Association. This is the Reverend Wyatt T. Walker. He was pastor of Gilfield Baptist Church, which is located in the Halifax Triangle Historic District. Wyatt T. Walker was the president of the NAACP. He was a civil rights leader in our community. Not only did he organize sit-ins and marches, he was also arrested numerous times. In June of 1960, he left Petersburg and he joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as his chief of staff of the Christian Southern Leadership Conference. This is Milton Reed. He was pastor of the First Baptist Church, which is located in the Poplar Lawn Historic District. He was a true civil rights leader in our community. He helped to organize marches, sit-ins, and held numerous prayer vigils. He also helped to found the Virginia chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which he was president for 42 years. This is Dorothy Cotton. This is Dorothy Cotton. She was a member of the Gilfield Baptist Church located in the Halifax Triangle Historic District. She was a true civil rights leader in our community. She went door to door gathering support. In addition to organizing sit-ins and marches, she also helped to train the protesters in nonviolent and non-confrontational techniques. In June of 1960, she joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., became the very first female executive officer of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and as some say that she was Dr. Martin Luther King's right-hand woman. This was S.S. Kresge's department store. On the 23rd of February, 1960, a group of 20 students from Peabody High School went into Kresge's. At the same time, two smaller groups went to McClellan's and W.T. Grant's. And what they did was they walked up to the lunch counters and they asked to see a menu. And they were told no, they needed to leave. They knew that they shouldn't be there. So what they did was they sat down and they stayed right there until the police came. When the police were called is when they left. The Kinney Public Library. It's located in the Poplar Lawn Historic District. It was the site of multiple sit-ins to protest segregation in the city. The second sit-in occurred on March the 7th of 1960, and that sit-in resulted in 11 people being arrested. The following night, the night of March the 8th of 1960, the Reverend Milton Reed, along with 200 supporters, met here, marched straight down Sycamore Street to the courthouse. This was the Old City Jail. Following the arrest at the library, Pastors Walker and Williams, along with a small handful of their supporters, were briefly held here. Okay. When they reached the courthouse, Pastor Reed gave a prayer vigil in their behalf. The prayer vigil lasted for 35 minutes. City officials had the lights turned out on him. However, his supporters had brought flashlights. By the end of the prayer, he also had the support of a very small handful of other members of the community. Following these events, the pastors Reed, Walker, and Williams organized a series of sit-ins at Woolworth's, Bluebird Theater, and Spiro's, and marches up and down Washington and Sycamore Street. These lasted for the entire spring and summer. Now, all of these protests were non-confrontational and non-violent. What they resulted in was many of the independent merchants integrated their shops willingly, and on the 7th of November 1960, the City Council voted to end segregation in all of the retail establishments and government buildings in Petersburg. They would march down Washington Street and make this left-hand turn onto Sycamore. In 1964, a mall was opened on the other side of town. With this mall opening, it caused the majority of the chain stores, such as JCPenney's, Sears, Montgomery Ward, to leave Sycamore Street and move into this nice new building with its nice, fresh, clean parking lot. And that began Sycamore Street downhill spiral. At this point, there were no other companies coming in to fill these spots, and many of the buildings on Sycamore Street were starting to go vacant. In 1979, another mall was opened in a neighboring city, and that was the Kiss of Death. Followed by 1985, when the very, very last of the large employers left town. And at that point is when life pretty much came to a standstill in the Courthouse Historical District. And what remains today is one of the most historically complete downtown areas on the East Coast. We have buildings that date from the year 1850 all the way into the 1930s. A mixture of architectural styles and building techniques that are almost seen nowhere else. When you come to the Courthouse Historical District, you do not get a feeling as if you've been transported back into another time. However, if you really open your eyes and look, you can still see very, very accurate representation of what life was like in an urban setting from the 1860s all the way through the 1960s. So I just want to thank you for tuning in today and for watching me here at Beyond Memory Old Movies talking about the Courthouse Historical District. We'll be going to our next historical district really soon, and I'm also thinking about doing something a little bit different, so please subscribe and click that notification bell. That way you know when I've posted my next video. Thank you again for watching.